This is Scott the Fix-It Guy. Today we're dealing with a GE profile stove that one of the venturi nuts that hold in the burner is stuck and it will not come loose. So we're going to be drilling it out with this tool, and then we're going to be doing a repair to get the burner functional. So the reason we were trying to remove the venturi nut in the first place was that the igniter would click on and would just stay on. So I was just trying to replace the igniter, which entails removing the venturi nut, but it ended up not coming out, and it ended up severing the gas line down at the bottom of the burner. So this procedure shows you how to remove the venturi nut, the brass nut, if you're not able to get it off. This little surface nut is the first one that comes off. That's usually no problem. But then there's one below that that you have to remove in order to do some of the procedures like removing the igniter. I'm going to use some of this penetrating compound on the threads. This is actually the back burner. This isn't the one that was affected, but this is a technique that can help. You put on the penetrating oil overnight ideally, and then you can see if it will come loose. You have to be a little careful though, because if you apply enough pressure to loosen it, but if it's just stuck, it'll end up turning the whole burner below the venturi nut, and that will break the gas tube, which is what happened on the front one. So I put the little nut back on, and I'm hitting it with a hammer to try to break loose some of the corrosion to see if that'll help. I took the brass nut back off. Now I'm going to try to loosen the venturi nut. So I got my socket on there, and it's still not budging. So I'm not going to go any further with this one because it could end up breaking the gas line underneath it. The front one is already broken, so I'm going to be using my drill and this step drill bit to drill out the brass nut. I'm going to just keep drilling until the top of this brass venturi is totally destroyed, and that'll let me get the top of the burner off, and that will allow me to replace the igniter. I still have to get in underneath to there we go, finally got that thing loose. By the way, this is edited, and this took a lot longer. It took probably a good 10 minutes of drilling to finally destroy the top of that brass venturi enough to get the burner plate off. Finally came off. But we still have to get underneath it to replace the severed gas line. So I'm going to show you a way of doing that too. Ideally, you would remove both of these burner plates here. You remove the venturi tubes and the burner plates, then you lift up this black plate, and then you can easily get in there and do whatever you want. But since the back one won't come off, I'm going to have to do it a different way. So I finally got that plate off by removing the venturi tube by destroying it. You can see all the brass particles. But now I have to get the broken burner piece off. So I'm going to remove this griddle assembly right next to the burner. This is how you do it. So you take these plates off, and these just lift off. And then there's this plate that also just lifts off. And once you get these all off, then you want to get this whole assembly out. There's a couple of screws holding it though in the front. You have to take off this trim piece. You just pry it off with a standard head screwdriver. And then there's two Phillips head screws underneath it. You just spin those out, and then you can lift up the whole thing. I had to use a standard head screwdriver to gently pry it up to kind of get it started. And then you have to disconnect the electrical connection to the igniter so you can get that thing out of the way. So I'll kind of show you how you do it. So sometimes you can lift it right out. I had to use a standard head screwdriver to pry it out a little bit to kind of get it started, to break the inertia. A little bit heavy. Just going to wiggle it out, lift it up. There you go. We still have to remove this glow igniter's connection right here. So make sure it's unplugged, and you're going to remove these two spade connectors, and then you also have to unscrew the wire nut to release the white wire, the neutral wire. And then you can get the whole griddle assembly out of there, and that gives you pretty good access on the right side and left side to do repairs to those burner assemblies without having to remove those goofy venturi nuts. You'll find this is a very similar procedure for the Thermador and Bosch stoves that have the brass venturi nut. There's just something about the brass going into the aluminum burner heads. They just, over maybe 2 years, they get corroded and you just can't get them out. They're like welded in. And if you turn them with the socket, it ends up just stripping out or breaking the gas tube. So here's the part that we're going to be replacing. This is the gas tube that broke. And here we are looking at the new one next to the old one. This is underneath the burner assembly. And what I used is some vice grips, some needle nose or long nose vice grips to be able to grip the nut on the old gas tube. Kind of hard to get to it, so you have to have some kind of a tool that will reach in. You grab the nut and just turn it a little bit with the vice grips to loosen it, so lefty-loosey, and then you should be able to spin it out. You can see it's a little bit hard to get to because there's some sheet metal in the way. There's about a 3/4 inch hole in the sheet metal. It's enough for you to get the needle nose vice grips in there. Here's the other side. You can kind of see how the burner tube and the burner looks on the healthy side. I think we got these parts from SearsDirect.com. Once you have the model number, you can get these parts. You can see them on the diagram. I'm just checking out this back burner while I've got it open, making sure that burner tube's okay. So I'm reaching in there, and now I'm just unscrewing that. I've already got the brass loose, so just unscrewing the tube, getting the old one out of there. There's the severed one. And got the new gas tube replaced. Now I'm trying to get a brass nut that's underneath this black plate. I'm trying to get this brass nut to loosen up. It's holding on the old broken burner assembly. So I'm using a pair of vice grips to grab onto that nut, and I'm using a crescent wrench to grab onto the old burner assembly. And then I'm going to be turning the nut toward me, which is the lefty-loosey. Now I got the burner, this is the old burner, out. I separated it from that nut, and there's the brass nut. So I've got a new burner assembly and a new igniter. This is the igniter. I'm using a small standard head screwdriver to remove a circlip that's holding the igniter to the old burner plate. I have to gently pry that circlip off. Be careful it doesn't just spring across the room. It's kind of small. Once I get that thing off, you can also maybe use a pair of needle nose pliers to pull it off. Then once you get it off, you can pull the spring off, and then you can pull the igniter out. This igniter was faulty, and it was just continually sparking. Even though it lit fine, it wouldn't extinguish. It would just keep sparking. When we exchanged it with a new igniter and tested it, it worked fine. So the igniter was the cause of this problem. When the igniter continues to spark, it's not always the igniter's fault. Sometimes it's the whole thing's wet, sometimes there's some corrosion, but in this case it was just a bad igniter. So we got the new igniter in, we're going to put the spring back on, and then we're going to push that little circlip into a groove. That'll hold the spring, and that holds the igniter in position. Again, this is exactly the same on the Thermador stove, and sometimes the circlips on the Thermador stoves get so old and rusty that they just break, and then the igniter kind of falls loose. We've got our new burner. We're going to put up inside that hole, and we're going to put that brass nut, holding it with a pair of vice grips, and I'm going to reach in and screw that new burner assembly up into that nut. This is not the best way to do this procedure. Normally you want to get this black plate off, and then it's really easy, but I can't get it off because I can't get the back burner off without destroying it. So I'm just going to try to adapt. I'm going to hold that nut with a pair of vice grips. And just take your time, push the burner up into that nut, turning it righty-tighty, and then got it all hooked up. Got the burner in position. I put the new gas tube onto it. I'm just tightening that by hand first, and then I'll tighten it with a wrench. Careful not to over tighten these because they're just brass and aluminum. Just get them snug. So I'm just using a pair of pliers to get that tighter. And that's it. We have a new igniter, we have a new gas tube, we have a new burner, and we're done. The next thing we do is just reassemble. After we have to test it, make sure it works, and then we'll just reassemble everything. We'll put the griddle assembly back in, and that's it. So here we are testing the new flame. We're going to test it here in a second. I'm sorry, this is the new venturi tube. This is the thing that messed us up in the first place. So we're screwing that in by hand. If you put a little anti-seize compound on the threads, it'd be a great idea, because then down the road it won't end up welding to the burner, and you'll be able to remove it. I'm just kind of watching it as I tighten it. I don't want to move that. I don't want to tighten it so much that that burner moves and severs the gas tube again. So it's really fun when you remove this griddle assembly because you get a lot of room. You can do many of the procedures you need to a lot faster and a lot easier than trying to remove the burner heads. I think if I had to do the igniter replacement again, I would just remove the griddle assembly and remove the circlip underneath the igniter and just pull the igniter straight out. It'd be a lot easier. So I'm just tightening that brass nut. We'll put the burner pieces back on.
Try to go back to the system of having the first half of the alphabet.
I'm putting the igniter wire spade connector back into the igniter. And there we go. Nice flame, and the clicking stops when it should. So hope this has been helpful to you, and please subscribe when you get a chance.